Hey guys, how's it going? Hope all of you are doing well tonight here on Wednesday. We're doing another one of these walkthroughs of the mysteries of the Catholic faith here. We've done about four of these so far. This is going to be our fifth iteration. I've been enjoying them quite a bit. I think it's really given me an opportunity to, kind of go back to the basics a little bit, kind of explore the foundations of the faith. I think sometimes we have a tendency, especially people who are interested in talking about theology, to get a little bit too lost in the weeds sometimes. So it's always nice to be able to take a step back and get at the big picture of things. And so I hope that these walkthroughs have been helpful to you. I hope you've been benefiting from them. I've actually been benefiting from them myself, just being able to, like I said, go back to the basics, study some of these more foundational theological ideas that undergird our faith. So I've really been enjoying doing these. So if you recall from our last stream, we finished talking about the angels, the creation of the angels. So we started off talking about the existence of God. We gave arguments for God's existence from the ground up, metaphysically from the ground up. We've showed how what we know about God can lead us into a foundation in making the leap of faith to the God of Christ, because we've established how what we know about God can lead to a plausibility case for the incarnation, and then we gave some historical arguments for that as well. We talked about the Trinity. We talked about how God is one divine reality in three divine persons. And then we talked about how God, out of the superabundance of his generosity, proceeds outwardly to the world of creatures. And so that begins with the spiritual creatures. And now we're going to talk about really the grand scheme of the arc of creation, the overarching divine purpose for which the entire cosmos is made. God obviously didn't merely create a world of spiritual creatures. He created a world of matter as well. And what you really get at when you ponder this arc of cosmic history, going from God's eternal inner life to his procession toward creatures and the creation of the angels, and then to the creation of matter leading up to the creation of man, you can trace all of this back to a gradual unfolding on God's part to manifest his infinite generosity in order to call the entire cosmos to himself in this heavenly marriage. And so that is the overarching foundational framework within which to understand his relationship to the world. And that can help us to get a sense of, okay, well, why did he create matter in the first place? And that's what we're going to get to in a second here, because we're going to go over the 6 days of creation. We're going to go over the biblical sequence of creation and how that culminates in the creation of man, and how the creation of man leads to the fall of man, and what original sin means. We're going to get into all those things. So this is really just getting into the origins of the entire cosmos. So, as I said, all of this begins with the initial act of creation. And this initial act of creation is the beginning of this unfolding of God's generosity. And we know that it comes out of his generosity because he's self-sufficient within himself. God is fully perfect within himself. He needs nothing. Without the world, God would be completely perfect. And so we can ask that question, okay, then why did he create? Why would he create anything if he didn't need anything? If he didn't need the world, why would he bother creating it? Usually when we do things, we do things to fulfill some unmet need as finite creatures, because in our finitude, we need to be fulfilled by things. And we are fulfilled by things by seeking them out. And so our activity, all of our activity as finite creatures, is ordered toward fulfilling our appetites in some way. And so it's quite mysterious to think of a reality doing something, especially outside of his own inner life, that doesn't benefit him in any way, that doesn't lead to any kind of an increase in his beatitude, that doesn't lead to an increase in his happiness and his blessedness. And yet that is exactly what we believe because of God's self-sufficiency. And so the logical conclusion is, okay, well, if he didn't create out of need, if he didn't create out of some unmet appetite, unfulfilled appetite, then he created purely out of gratuitous love. And so God, out of his infinite generosity, he does not want to withhold his own inner self-communicative Trinitarian outpouring from being participated in by creatures that are not divine. And so that is the divine impetus, so to speak, for the creation of the entire cosmos. God creates in order to share his inner life with creatures, just out of the pure, gratuitous generosity of his infinite love. Metaphysically, that is the only reason for creation that you could deduce logically from a reality that is perfect within himself. And so this gets to the question that I was asked in a power chat last time. Love really is the foundation of all things. Every moment of finite existence is itself a donation, as it were, of God's being to creation. Every single moment of the existence of anything, inasmuch as it exists, for as long as it exists, is a completely unmerited, gratuitous gift proceeding out of the generosity of God's love. And so we should think about that in our own daily lives, right? Every single moment of our existence is an ongoing reception of a completely gratuitous and unmerited gift of divine infinite love. And so that's the motivation for creation. That is the motivation behind why God does anything to anybody, is out of gratuitous, generous love. And so hence you get the procession of creatures. Now, again, it's important to reiterate, God did not need to create. So there's no necessity on God's part to create. So all of this is coming out as a result of God's freedom, as a result of his liberty. He is supremely free in everything that he does. And so he freely decided to create the order of things. And this order of creation proceeds firstly with the angels. We already talked about the angels, so we don't have to get into that again. And then it proceeds to the material cosmos. And Christianity is pretty unique in insisting that God actually directly creates matter. And a lot of the other ancient philosophies, usually matter is as a result of some kind of a falling away from the one, from the unity of the one. Multiplicity comes about as a result of falling away from the one. And so matter is in itself, on this reading, essentially compromised in some way. It is a falling away from harmony with the one, with the divine. The Christian view of things is completely antithetical to that. We do not believe that matter is as a result of some intermediary demiurge imposing itself on the material cosmos. We believe that God himself crafts the lowliest of material beings effortlessly out of love for each of those things that he created. It's a lot easier to just to get at how mysterious this really is when you think about it. It's a lot easier to understand why material creation requires an immaterial cause than it is to understand how the immaterial cause brings about material creation. And that's easier because we are material. So we have the benefit of, or rather I should say, we have sort of a bias in that we are material creatures, and so we can understand how we are contingent, and that contingency cries out for a non-contingent source of our existence. So it's very easy to get a sense of why, from the standpoint of material creation, you need an immaterial creator. But it's a little bit more tricky to think, okay, we know this immaterial creation exists, then why on earth would he bring about all of this very specific, concrete diversity of material creatures? It is really odd. I mean, you would think that the one out of the one God would simply precede creatures most like himself, immaterial creatures, spiritual creatures, simple creatures, such as angels. And so the fact that the material world even exists at all is a testament to, like I said, this divine tendency to withhold absolutely nothing of what he could share with creatures. And this really gets to the radicality of God's love that Christianity, in a very unique way, is able to touch on. That everything that exists, no matter what, is a result of God's active desire for it to be. So that's just that's just a way to preface what we're going to be talking about in this stream. And this supreme divine generosity, it's going to culminate, of course, in the creation of man. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But just kind of getting a sense of the sequence of this. And we'll define man. It's important to get a sense of, okay, what is man in a relationship to the rest of material creation? It really help us get a firmer sense of the sequence of creation when we understand the purpose for which all of these things are created. And man is, as many of the fathers referred to him as, a minor mundi, or a little world. And that's because we're composed of both matter and spirit. And so man is really the most precious handiwork of God in being able to sum up the rest of material creation. We'll get into that a little bit more in a little while. But it is, I think, the central anthropological principle in getting at human identity. There's a lot of ways you can get at human identity. You can talk about the fact that, okay, well, we're rational creatures, and as rational creatures, we're made in the image and likeness of God. But the angels are also rational creatures, so why would God need to come out with this strange hybrid of spirit and matter? What purpose in the divine wisdom does that serve? And as we'll find out as we explore this topic together, it really does tie the rest of creation together in this beautiful masterpiece of divine art. So, but let's back up a little bit. Let's get into the sequence of creation. And so, of course, in Scripture, in the book of Genesis, we have the unfolding of material creation taking the form of the famous 6 days of creation. Now, I want to give a little prefatory note on the 6 days of creation, because there is a lot of theological debate, there's a lot of theological discussion in the church about in what sense do we mean the 6 days of creation. We can ask a lot of questions about that right out of the gate. What is a Catholic bound to believe about the 6 days of creation? Is there a monolithic theological interpretation on that? Are Catholics bound to believe in the 6 days of creation as actual 24-hour durations of time that are sequenced precisely in this way as the sacred author describes them in a scientific sense? What the church is going to say about that is we're fully free to accept that view. This was the view of most of the fathers of the church and most of the scholastics. They accepted this realist interpretation of the 6 days. But it wasn't unanimous among the fathers. And for that reason, the church has been very adamant in affirming that this realist interpretation is not binding on Catholics. Now, I'm not going to argue in favor of one interpretation over the other. That's a little bit beyond me. And nor am I going to try to impose by way of precept one interpretation over another. The church prohibits us from doing that to fellow Catholics. 'Cause there are some Catholics who will say that if you don't believe in the 6 days of creation as literally understood as 24-hour periods of time, then you're somehow anathema from the church. Well, the church has been very adamant in repudiating that view, and that goes actually all the way back to Leo XIII. Leo XIII in Providentissimus Deus explicitly says that when Scripture intersects with the natural sciences, there is much room for interpretation on part of the individual Catholic. And I'll quote from St. Augustine here to bolster that point. Again, I myself don't really have a set position on this. And so for that reason, I'm not going to come across very dogmatically when I speak on this issue. But I do want to quote what St. Augustine said, just so we can all be on the same page, at least with respect to the amount of freedom there is for an individual Catholic to interpret these things differently. And he says, quote, "It not infrequently happens that something about the earth, about the sky, about other elements of this world, about motion and rotation, or even the magnitude and the distances of stars, about definite eclipses of the sun and the moon, the passage of years and seasons, about the nature of the animals, of fruits and stones, and other such things, may be known with the greatest certainty by reasoning or by experience, even by one who is not a Christian. It too is disgraceful and ruinous, though, and greatly to be avoided, that he hear a Christian speaking idiotically on these matters," and that's not me saying that the literal 6 days are idiotic. I think he's giving an example. And as if in accord with Christian writings, that he might say that he could scarcely keep from laughing when he saw how totally in error they are. In view of this, and in keeping in mind constantly while dealing with the book of Genesis, I have, insofar as I was able, explained in detail and set forth for consideration the meanings of obscure passages, taking care not to affirm rashly some one meaning to the prejudice of another, and perhaps better explanation. With the Scriptures, it is a matter of treating about the faith. For that reason, as I have noted repeatedly, if anyone, not understanding the mode of divine eloquence, should find something about these matters, about the physical universe, in our books, or hear of the same of those books of such a kind that it seems to be at variance with the perceptions of his own rational faculties, let him believe that these other things are in no way necessary to the admonitions or accounts or predictions of the Scriptures. In short, it must be said that our authors knew the truth about the nature of the skies, but it was not the intention of the Spirit of God, who spoke through them, to teach men anything that would not be of use to them for their salvation. So this is actually where you get that famous quote from the Second Vatican Council about that phrase, for the sake of our salvation, in terms of the inerrancy of Scripture. Now, with this quote, essentially we want to understand that just because there's a variety of ways of interpreting the 6 days of creation for a Catholic, that A doesn't mean that one view isn't more plausible than another. We should, however, be careful about, like I said, being too dogmatic in our interpretations of these 6 days of creation. And I think that's important spiritually, because if you do come off as too dogmatic in your interpretation of these things, it can lead to some Catholics, it can cause some of them to enter into a crisis of faith. Because there are a lot of Catholics who maybe are studying the empirical sciences, and they are very convinced of, say, an evolutionary account of biodiversity. And they're convinced of this through their own independent empirical research. And if you have some Catholic telling them that they are, regardless of what the magisterium says, bound to one specific interpretation of the 6 days of creation on pain of being outside of communion with the church, well, that's going to cause them quite a crisis of faith, and it's unnecessary to do so. So I'm very much of the mind that we should not even attempt to impose on others things that are not necessary or obligatory for them to believe. We can make arguments about it, for sure, but we should refrain from imposing on them interpretations that they're not actually bound to hold. And the magisterium of the church is pretty clear that that you're not bound by the more literalist interpretation of the 6 days of creation. And this is echoed in a lot of pre-Vatican II writers as well, like Ludwig Ott is a major one, for example. So I just wanted to have that preface to frame the discussion of this issue. And so this, we obviously know that Origen of Alexandria.
Requiem sent $51.
Well, thank you very much, Requiem. I really appreciate that. Thank you for the big power chat there. Really appreciate it. Thank you. We have a quote from a father, Origen of Alexandria. I mean, he's kind of a father, he's kind of not a father. I think there's a really good quote about Origen of Alexandria where they say that he is simultaneously the best of the fathers and the worst of the fathers. And I think that's true. He has a lot of worthwhile wisdom with respect to biblical interpretation and biblical exegesis. But of course, he has that problem. As we all know, he castrated himself, and he held to apokatastasis, meaning like the universal salvation of all, the reconciliation of all to the one, and so that was a problem. But he says, quote, "For who that has understanding will suppose that the first and the second and the third day existed without the sun and the stars, and that the first day was, as it were, also without the sky. I do not suppose that anyone doubts that these things figuratively indicate certain mysteries, the history having taken place in appearance and not literally." So we do have some fathers of the church who do take a more allegorical, figurative interpretation of Genesis. And this follows the tradition of Philo of Alexandria as well. He was a big proponent of allegorism. And again, my own view on the whole question of evolution, I'll be straightforward about it. I'll be honest about it. I'm agnostic about the scientific viability of evolutionary theory, just in general. And I think that reflects my view toward the empirical sciences in a more general way as well. I think that empirical science, specifically more theoretical branches of experimental science, in other words, subjects of experimental science that are not amenable to direct observation. So that obviously gets into cosmic history, that gets into quantum mechanics. These areas of experimental science are not, like I said, directly amenable to empirical investigation in terms of observation. And for that reason, I do have sort of a scientific anti-realist view of these things. I'm a philosophical realist, so I believe that the universals of things are real, the forms of things are real, and the substances of our perceptual experience are real, they're extramental. But I do think that empirical experimental science is blinded by all sorts of epistemological limitations. For example, you have just this problem of you have the measurement problem in a quantum mechanics. You have the problem that the results of quantum mechanics have to be interpreted through the medium of the instruments, which are themselves supposedly subject to the very same quantum mechanical laws that you're only discovering through the use of these instruments. So the very fact that you're using a corporeal instrument or corporeal scientific instrument to get data about corporeal objects as such, about their microscopic makeup, that in itself is an epistemological barrier. There's also the fact that it's a lot of interpretations of quantum mechanics are really just reifications of mathematical models, and the mathematical models are derived from accurate predictions. So I'm not questioning the accuracy of quantum mechanics, but in terms of getting qualitative interpretations of what these entities really are, that's all going to be funneled through philosophical presuppositions, models that are not themselves direct products of the investigation. It's going to be a result of all sorts of presuppositions that do not follow immediately from the data. And so there's this big epistemological barrier with experimental science. And for that reason, I would never in a million years appeal to scientific data or results from experimental science, especially about subject matter that is not directly observable. I would never in a million years appeal to that to force an interpretation of Scripture. Now, some people do. Some people have different epistemological hang-ups about the degree of certainty that experimental science can give you. But I'm kind of an anti-realist when it comes to that. I don't know. I'm not committed to really anything that we get out of, in terms of qualitative interpretations that we get out of astronomy. Like, I don't know. Nobody really knows. So much of that is funneled through these models. And so for that reason, I'm very skeptical, generally speaking, about scientific narratives. So my own view is being very agnostic about the scientific viability of something like evolutionary theory. So I refrain from pontificating on the matter, generally speaking.
Anonymous sent $10 smile.
Well, thank you for the 10, Anonymous. I smile right back at you. So yeah, my view on evolution is very much, like I said, agnostic. If the biodiversity we experience does originate along evolutionary lines, I would be committed to the view that this would be foreseen by divine wisdom. And I've given a framework in our last stream about the angels within which to understand something like that. So it would be accounted for by appealing to the fall of the angels. And so the fallen angels would have prevented what would have been the seamless unfolding of material creatures mirroring the divine ideas. And they would have therefore introduced the chaos and death into the mixture of evolutionary theory. Or rather, I should say evolutionary development. They would have been responsible for that. I refuse to believe that if biological evolution is true, that it's a result of God's antecedent will. I think that is abhorrent, actually. I think if it is true, if it does reflect the true development of the cosmos, it would have been as a result of God's permissive will, as a result of the fall of the angels. And we talked a lot about that in our last stream. And so divine providence, with the cooperation of his holy angels, would have made sure that this cosmic chaos that's introduced from the fall of the angels, nevertheless, even in spite of the evolutionary development, would have tended toward divine order. So you have St. Augustine's concept of the ratione seminalis. And so Augustine believed that actually biodiversity did develop or unfold out of these primordial forms. He did believe that, but it's obviously very different from the concept of evolutionary speciation. And so but on an evolutionary view, these primordial forms, if they would have developed evolutionarily, would, as a result of the intervention of the good angels and under the direction of divine providence, you would actually get a mirror of the resurrection in that. So I worded that a little bit awkwardly, so maybe just back up a little. If evolutionary theory is true, if biodiversity did arise from out of an evolutionary mode of development, then that would have been a result of the fall of the angels, so the evil angels would have introduced chaos or dissonance into the mix.
American Boy IA sent $5. I love you, CT. God bless you.
Well, thank you very much, American Boy. Thank you for the $5. Really appreciate that. Love you too, man. So, given the supposition of evolution, that would have been a result of the evil angels bringing in chaos and dissonance into this divine symphony that we talked about in the last stream. And God and his holy angels would have foreseen this, and they would have made sure that even in spite of that evolutionary and chaotic development of things, even in spite of the desire of the evil angels to bring about chaos into the equation, chaos and death into the equation, they would have ensured that the forces of order, the forces of divine order, would have won out. And so Boyer talks about how, on an evolutionary view, yes, animal death, animal corruption would have entered into the equation, but out of this death, you would get, under the governance of divine providence, you would get the gradual emergence and tending toward greater and greater and greater and greater order. So, if evolutionary theory is true, I do think you can still weave some grandeur out of this worldview through a theistic lens and through an angelic lens, through the lens of angelology, because I think there's a lot of Catholics who like to embrace theistic evolution, but they have no real way of explaining how this unfolding of events can mirror divine wisdom. They really, they kind of get tongue-tied when they try to explain that. But on the angelological view, in light of Bouyer, we can still maintain, contra Thomas Aquinas actually, and contra St. Basil the Great, that all corruption, all animal death, even on an evolutionary view, is a result of sin. See, St. Basil and St. Thomas, they actually believed in animal death before the fall. I mean, they didn't have an evolutionary account of biodiversity, but they did believe in animal death before the fall. But they don't say that it arises from the sin of the angels. They would say that, well, that's just kind of a necessary result
Person sent $5.
of,
Smart fella, this guy.
of multiplicity. Thank you very much for the power chat. Let me just... I didn't see your name, so let me... Oh, your name is Person. Okay. Well, thanks. Really appreciate that. So, so they actually believed in animal death before the fall. But they don't really have a mechanism of explaining how that would nevertheless remain a result of sin. And Boyer actually does that very well, I think. So that's that. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because, I know that a lot of you are far more skeptical of evolution than most Catholics. I understand that. I'm skeptical of it too. I just got done saying that. But I just wanted to, if some of you are drawn to an evolutionary account of biodiversity, I do want to just affirm that, the church tolerates your opinion, you're allowed to have it, and there are some theological principles we can throw into the mix that can prevent that worldview from tarnishing divine wisdom. And so I just wanted to talk about that. So the 6 days, let's kind of get started with just going over the 6 days of creation, however we want to interpret it. So if we want to interpret it figuratively, if we want to interpret it literally, there's still value in going through the sequence nonetheless. So we have the 6 days of creation divided into stages, you could say, of chaos, regions, and occupants. And that's a really weird way of phrasing it, I get that, but just allow me to explain a little bit.
Connoisseur sent $6.77.
Well, thanks so much, Connoisseur, for the $6.77. It's an interesting, a very precise amount. Maybe it's a result of another currency. But thank you very much. You guys have been very generous this stream. I really appreciate that. That means a lot. It really helps me to keep doing these things. And by the way, by all means, if you have any questions, comments throughout the stream, you can use Power Chat for that too. So thank you very much for all the donations. It means a lot. So chaos. What this basically refers to is, the very first line in Genesis, where it says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." And so what this is getting at, there are varying interpretations on this. Some people think that this is just the creation of matter, and by matter I don't mean like physical stuff. I mean matter in the philosophical sense of the word. So matter as in the underlying substratum of change. So in our philosophical system, we believe that everything is composed of form and matter. The form of the thing gives it its identity, gives it its principle of intelligibility. In other words, the principle whereby a thing is what it is, and matter is the underlying substratum, as it were, that receives that identity and accounts for how we can have multiple instances of that form being instantiated in things. And so some people interpret the primordial chaos that's spoken of at the beginning of Genesis as just matter. St. Thomas is going to reject that view. And he rejects that view because philosophically it doesn't make sense to speak of just matter without form. Now we do believe in prime matter, so prime matter is just the underlying capacity to receive substantial form of any kind. But pure matter just on its own cannot exist without an identity. And so for that reason we would not say that the primordial chaos is just matter. So we would reject that view. That being said, we can refer to it as as prime matter in simultaneity with the reception of the first light. So this gets a little bit tricky because you don't want to think of all of these instances within the 6 days of creation as all being loosely separate in the order of time. You don't want to do that because then you get a little bit screwed up. So when you have the cosmos being without form and void and darkness covering over the face of the deep, that is in simultaneity with God speaking light into being. And so analogously considered, these layers of chaos are going to constitute the material dimension of the 6 days. But again, not as separated from the primordial light. So what are these 3 layers of chaos that we have? And these are covered over the span of days. So you have the primordial darkness, you have water, and you have the earth. Each of these are sort of the underlying substrata for what would become the main categories of creation. And so what does darkness correspond with then? Darkness, each of these layers of chaos correspond to a formal element that is then further divided. So the primordial darkness you have that can correspond with day and night, with light. Sea and air, or water, is going to correspond to sea and air, and the earth corresponds to the land under the water and over the water. And so you can think of these 3 layers of chaos corresponding with what's going to fill them, in other words. And so it's actually a very beautifully, poetically structured reading. So even if you take like a literalist account of the sequence of the 6 days of creation, you have to recognize how poetically beautiful the structure is. As Catholics, we can believe that something is actually simultaneously symbolic and literal. In fact, I would argue that the closer something is to God, the closer something is to God's presence, the more broken down is the distinction between symbol and reality. Think about how a sacrament works. In a sacrament is a result of God's presence actualizing something in a supernatural way. So a very strong degree of divine intimacy being obtained in a sacrament. And in a sacrament, you have the symbol actually becoming that which the symbol signifies.
American Boy IE sent $10.
Thank you again for the 10, American Boy. I mean, that's the second one you've given, so thank you very much. In a sacrament, the distinction between symbol and reality really does break down in that instance. And you also have in the resurrection narrative, I believe it's the Gospel of Mark, where it says that the Son of God rose again in coordination with the actual rising of the sun. And so you have the literal rising of the sun corresponding perfectly with the rising of the sun. So, like I said, the more divine something is, or the closer the relationship is between something and God's presence, the more you lose the distinction between symbol and reality. God is an artist. He's a grand artist. So when he acts in the world, it's going to be poetic. So even if you take a very literalist interpretation of Genesis, you should not allow that to obfuscate its poetic its poetic richness. It is poetry, okay? Like it is. Like Genesis is poetry. Even if all of the events are perfectly reflected in the empirical unfolding of sequential events in history, it's still poetry, but it's real poetry. So I just wanted to make that point. So each of these levels of chaos, like I said, correspond to a certain region. So, and by the way, I'm just going over the structure of the 6 days before we get to the actual sequence of the days. I'm just giving you a structure here, a framework. So let me scroll down here a little bit for you. Yeah. So each layer of chaos corresponds to a region, and each region is going to correspond to the occupants. So think about this in terms of philosophical causality. You have material cause, formal cause, final cause. Okay, the material substratum that is that out of which something is made. You have the identity of the thing, and then you have that for the sake of which the thing exists. And so darkness is the substratum for day, the concept of day and night. And that exists for the sake of the sun and the moon and the stars. Water is the substratum for the sea and the air. And they exist for the sake of the sea creatures and the birds. The earth exists for the sake of the land that is under and over the water, and that exists for the sake of plants, animals, and man. So you have this beautiful sequence that unfolds here. So that gets just to the overall structure of what these days are really trying to get at. So the concept of a day, therefore, it can be interpreted in a metaphoric sense to refer to the poetic means of measuring the order of creation, and it can refer to a literal sequence of 6 days, if you would like to interpret it that way. So let's actually get into the days of creation. I see there's an argument in the chat about the role of philosophy. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to disagree with you, low IQ retard, and that's not me insulting you. That's literally his name. I do think that the influence of Plotinus and Aristotle and Plato and the Middle Platonists and Philo, they have had a positive influence on the development of Christian thought. But on the other hand, because you have to think about how they influenced the councils. The early councils were able to come to the conclusions that they were able to come to with the help of these philosophical categories that were imported from Hellenistic philosophy. We wouldn't have a very accurate way of explaining the hypostatic union of Christ's human and divine natures without use of philosophical concepts like hypostasis and substance, ousia and homoousia. So we benefit greatly from the use of philosophy. What Scripture says is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And so we do want to be approaching the mysteries of God through the mode of our own human mind, because grace perfects nature. That's actually something we'll talk about a little bit later. And yeah, you are right that emanationism is false. Definitely, creation is not just an emanation, but studying emanationism can actually help you get at a deeper truth about the Trinity, because there is emanation within God. It just isn't reflected in creation necessarily. The concept of Plotinus emanation has its use in Trinitarian theology, because God, out of the fecundity of his own self-communicative goodness, does emanate within himself. So God's emanation is so perfect that it's fully contained within his own divine nature. and it doesn't necessarily flow out of himself and bleed into creation. So I do think it's important to study the errors of the pagan philosophers, and that can help us actually be more secure in the mysteries of our faith. So that's just a little aside there. Okay, so day one. Let's talk about day one. So the creation of light. Now, I could go on for hours about light. I'm not going to, but there's a very important mystical significance to the concept of light. We tend to overlook that when we read scripture. You say, oh, let there be light. Okay, wonderful. But there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. In fact, philosophers in the Middle Ages, I'm thinking of specifically of one of my favorites, Robert Grosseteste. He has a whole treatise on light, and he speaks of it in very metaphysical terms, in very metaphysical and even spiritual terms. Light is not just photons. Like, if you think that, there's like no hope for you, basically. If you think light is just reducible to photons, you are just depriving yourself of wisdom. So, light, you just think about it in terms of how we speak, right? We cannot but talk about light in terms of its relationship to knowledge. So when we say something is enlightening, when we say, I see your point, are we just dealing in metaphor? No, I don't think we're just dealing in metaphor. Light is primarily spiritual and secondarily material. When we use concepts like divine illumination, or the light of Christ, the light of the world, the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome it. When we use that language, we are using spiritual language primarily. We are not dealing primarily in metaphor. We are dealing primarily in spiritual language that photons, or the physical manifestation of light, merely reflects or mirrors. It's really important to reverse our way of thinking about these things. So light is more than just the mere physical substance of light. It really is the closest material analog we have to spiritual substances. So Augustine, for example, when he interprets this passage to actually refer to the procession of spiritual creatures from God's creative will. Grosseteste thought it was the first form from which all other material forms are derived. It's kind of like how a multitude of colors proceeds from white light as through a prism. We used that analogy last time. And you can actually see this phenomenon of light being the first form reflected analogously in our electronics, right? I mean, screens, television, imagery, concrete imagery arises from the simplicity of light. Like specific, defined imagery arises from the simplicity of light. And so Grosseteste is going to say that the first spiritual form is light, and out of light, it kind of fulfills the same role as prime matter does, but for form. And so he gives a very robust metaphysical account of the concept of let there be light. So I only went on that tangent to show that all of these insights that you get from the 6 days of creation are explored in great intellectual and philosophical length by our tradition. That's the creation of light. Light being, like I said, that first primordial form that can give rise to all of the other concrete forms of material substances. That's light. Day 2, creation of the firmament. So some refer to the firmament as the starry heavens, but most are going to refer to it as essentially the sky and the seas. That's why you have the division into the two waters, right? In light of that, though, there are different notions of heaven that are implicit within this concept, and I just want to explore those for just a quick second. So you have the heaven of the blessed, which is more referring to the spiritual state of the soul that receives the beatific vision. Then you have heaven referring to the starry firmament, and then you have heaven insofar as we understand them as supernaturally received visions. So when St. Paul talks about he was raised up into the third heaven, Augustine's going to say that refers to like the supernaturally received vision within his interior life. So there are different ways in which we can conceive of the concept of heaven in Catholic theology. So you don't want to get too confused about the usage of that word in Scripture. So Day 3, the formation of the earth. Okay. Formation of the earth. So you have the formation of the earth over and under the waters, out of which is going to come vegetative life. Now some are going to interpret this day structure that we're using as referring more to principles of origin and temporally ordered sequences of events. So more in terms of saying that, the stars and the sun and the moon arises from the firmament, and the creatures of the earth arise from the earth. So more speaking in terms of derivation than a temporal sequence of events. So I just wanted to make that caveat as we go through these days here. Some interpret them as just the sequence of days. Some interpret them as more causes of effects. Okay, day 4, we have the star, the sun, and the moon. These are going to be the luminaries of the sky, in addition to the sun, as distinct from that primordial light of the first day. So the primordial light of the first day is categorically different from the sun and the moon and the stars. And again, that should be made pretty apparent just by reading through Genesis, but it is important to draw these things out. Day 5.
Inquisitas sent $3 Hi CT. I thought this quote from Plato's Phaedo complements your statement about light. Socrates says light and sight are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun.
Yeah, that's true. Like that's all over, that's up and down the tradition. Like this concept, this metaphysical concept that should undergird our conception of light. It's not just light, by the way. It's other concepts too. We should really get used to thinking about concepts like that less in terms of metaphor and more in terms of analogy. So again, with light and illumination, light is primarily spiritual, secondarily material, and that should really help to inform how we take in spiritual language like this. Okay. So, day 5. As the fourth day sees the first layer of chaos filled with occupants, so the fifth day sees the second layer filled with occupants. So these relate back to each other. So when you look at the fourth day, the stars, the sun, and the moon, that refers back to the first layer of chaos that we talked about, namely darkness. Darkness giving rise to the sun and the moon and the stars. And similarly, the fifth day refers back to that second layer of chaos, namely the water. And then the sixth day is kind of refer back to the third layer of chaos. So you have this poetic structure. Like I said, it's important to keep in mind that this is a poetic structure. Okay, so day 6, we have land, animals, and man. So man is created last in the whole order of creation, as a priest is last in the order of a liturgical procession. So we really want to think of mankind and human nature as serving this priestly role in this grand cosmic liturgy. It should take on a new light as well in terms of the incarnation, because the incarnation is going to revitalize this priestly concept of man. But even considered prior to the incarnation, man is last. Again, think back to a liturgical procession. I'm sure you've all been to Mass, right? Who's last in the procession? It's the priest. And similarly, man is supposed to be this mediator between the spiritual and the material. He's supposed to be this mediator between spirit and matter, and as the mediator between spirit and matter, he can enable the whole of material creation, the whole of the material cosmos, to participate in the divine life. And so man fulfills this priestly role in the whole cosmic order of things. Okay, so that's day 6. And day 7, we have the divine Sabbath rest. Now, rest does not refer to God being exhausted and resting as a result of his exhaustion. No, that's not what it refers to. But it refers more to a cessation of his creative operation, at least in the order of creating categorically new kinds of things. Because he continues to sustain the order of creation. He is always creating. He has not stopped creating. And he still sustains all things toward his providential ends. But what has stopped is the creation of new fundamental kinds of things. That's not going to change. That has been completed. That has been finished. And another thing that rest also refers to is the richness of God's inner blessedness. In that once he creates the world, once he accomplishes his work of creation, his initial work of creation, he does remain fully happy and blessed within himself, within his own inner life, considered wholly apart from creation. So, again, God is not in any way determined by his creation. He's not moved by his creation. He, throughout all eternity, rests peacefully and blessedly within his own inner life. So that can get at sort of a mystical reading of the seventh day. And this is, of course, why we have rest that is incorporated within our liturgical life. So, of course, with the Jews, they have the concept of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is really supposed to be for the sake of man mirroring this blessedness that God has within himself. So man focuses more inwardly on himself, on his family, on the life of his family, and the Sabbath rest calls back to the divine resting in himself, looking upon and governing his creation once it had been established. Okay, so that's the 6 days of creation plus the 7th day of rest. So that was just kind of going over that sequence here. There's so much more that could be said about this, but I didn't want to spend most of the stream on that. I mean, that's stuff you can read about pretty straightforwardly. I wanted to talk a little bit more theologically, though, about the creation of man, his state in paradise, and original sin. That's really the main purpose for which I wanted to do this stream. So man, like I said, what is his purpose? What is God's purpose for creating man? Man is created, like I said, to enable the whole of material creation to partake of the divine nature. And this should call us back to what we talked about when we discussed the angels, right? The angels were meant to play out this divine symphony of the whole of the cosmos. But that symphony reaches its crescendo in man. Because man is going to be able to harmonize the whole symphony in one substance. Human nature is able to harmonize all of the distinct layers of creation within one substance. The hierarchy of being is harmonized within man himself. And so man, therefore, is going to fulfill two purposes in the order of creation. One of those purposes is certain theologically. The other is a little bit more speculative, again, in light of Boyer's theorizing. So the first one is, like I said, that man can serve as the means whereby the whole of the cosmos can partake of the divine nature. I've said this 1,000 times, but I'm going to repeat it and keep reiterating it because it is a very important spiritual point, that human nature is a microcosm of the whole of creation. We are composed of all the fundamental categories of the hierarchy of being, of the great chain of being. And in so doing, we summarize all of creation. So we have in common with inanimate matter a basic constitution of chemical elements. We have similarly vegetative capacities for growth, and response to stimuli. And we have sensuous capacities shared with the animals. We have inner and outer instinct. We have the capacity for reproduction. And then we have, in common with the angels, the capacity for intellectual life. And so we really do sum up the entirety of creation within ourselves. And by the way, this is a really good way to rebut the atheist canard about, well, Neil deGrasse Tyson told me that we're just specks, or no, Carl Sagan told me we're just specks on the pale blue dot, and really nothing matters in the grand scheme of things because look at how big a nebula is, look at how big a galaxy is, and we're just a speck within a speck within a speck within a speck, and therefore we're insignificant and we don't matter. Well, the nebula and the collection of stars, they're not able to circumscribe the whole of creation. We can. By virtue of our intellectual capacity, we can contain the whole universe within our minds because our intellects have a universal scope. There's a universality to the capacity of our minds to grasp at truth. And so for that reason, in a certain way, we have already circumscribed the entirety of the whole cosmos by virtue of the potentiality of our intellect. Similarly, only mankind is able to act or represent the whole cosmos. And in addition to that, before we knew about distant galaxies or nebulae or anything like that, we believed in angels. Like we believed that that creation was populated by an uncountable number of almost quasi infinitely immense power and glory and splendor, and we are nothing in our capacities in comparison to those beings. We were always aware of the relative smallness of human nature. In fact, the psalmist says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" So we've always been aware of this concept in our tradition. So we shouldn't be moved by this atheistic canard, especially in light of the concept of man as the microcosm of the whole of creation. So that's the first idea. Or that's the first purpose for which man is created. The second purpose is, again, on the supposition that evil entered into the material cosmos through angelic sin, which is Boyer's position, Adam and Eve can kind of serve the role as a proto-redeemer of the cosmos. So Adam and Eve can right the wrong of the angels with respect to material creation. Remember, there's an intimate link between angelic being and material being, in that the purpose of the angels was to play the divine symphony of the unfolding of the material cosmos. And so once they fell and introduced dissonance into that cosmic symphony, man has an opportunity, being material himself, to redeem or to recapitulate what had come before him in the grand order of the cosmos. And so they had that role as the potential redeemer of an already fallen cosmos. And they could have potentially Edenized the rest of the cosmos through their obedience with the divine will. So that's another more theoretical, speculative opinion with regard to the purpose of man. Okay. So, when God creates man, he says, of course, in Scripture, "Let us make man in our image." So man is created in the image and likeness of God, so that man can have friendship with and communion with God. That's the purpose for which he creates man, is for that intimacy with us, and by extension with the whole order of creation through us. And so, as I said, God wanted the whole of the cosmos to be summed up in this final handiwork, and only man would enable all of creation to abide in this intimate harmony with him. So the rest of creation is really made for the sake of man as its center and crown. Gaudium et Spes makes that point in the Second Vatican Council. So the angels are made to minister to our spiritual needs, and inanimate matter and plant life and animal life, they all exist for the sake of our material needs. So the whole rest of creation that we sum up in our substance is meant to serve and to minister to our needs, because we are that grand handiwork of creation. And so everything is, in a way, is meant to revolve around man. In a way, we're not geocentric, we're not heliocentric, we are anthropocentric. I mean, we do believe that humanity is, in a certain sense, the center of the cosmos. And that's taken on a new light in light of the incarnation, because we would say that actually Christ is the center of the whole cosmos. But Christ, insofar as he is united with humanity. And so, but we haven't gotten to Christ yet. So we just want to talk about the cosmic purpose for the sake of which man was created. Okay. So, just a quick word before we move on any further about the evolution of the human body. Now, I personally and I know I said I was agnostic about the evolutionary origins of biodiversity, and I am, but I do repudiate the concept of the evolution of the human body. I think that if there was an evolutionary account of biodiversity, nevertheless, human beings were made entirely separate from that process in the precise manner in which it is communicated to us through the biblical text. So I do believe that absolutely. But I will, again, in the interest of just being level-headed about these things, I will reiterate the position of the Church. And so Pius XII, in Humani Generis, he does permit a Catholic to believe that some form of bodily or material substratum from which Adam was fashioned may have come about through an evolutionary process. So, while they are permitted to believe that, however, they do have to believe in the special creation of Adam and Eve. And they have to believe that the soul of Adam and Eve came directly and immediately from God's creative act. So you cannot believe that the soul somehow evolved, or that the powers of the soul somehow evolved out of material processes. You also can't believe in that the soul is an emanation from either divine or angelic causality. No, it is a result of God's free decision to create each rational soul ex nihilo, out of nothing, directly. So, that is absolutely has to be held by a Catholic. And you also cannot believe in polygenism. So as a Catholic, you have to believe that the whole human race came from Adam and Eve. One pair of human parents. You cannot believe that that humanity came about from a more plural community of hominids or something. Now, what you might be able to say, you might be able to believe that maybe a primitive, non-human species gave rise to the, say, material substratum from which God then fashioned Adam and Eve. I don't know why you would want to believe that, because look, even if you accept like the fossil record, you accept the DNA evidence for evolution, you accept all of these bits and pieces of scientific evidence for evolutionary theory, none of that at all is going to compel you to believe that Adam and Eve were a result of that evolutionary process. Even with Homo habilis, Homo erectus, etc., we don't have. There's nothing in the data to compel us to believe that any one of those was the direct precursor to a rational animal. You don't have to believe that. Like, even if you accept what the scientific data purports to show you, none of that implies in any way that Adam and Eve came from that evolutionary process. You could believe that it was an entirely separate event and still accept all of that data. So I just don't understand why anyone would be compelled to believe in the evolution of the human body, because there's no scientific reason to, even in light of like Darwinian evolution. There's no scientific reason to believe that. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit rambly there. But nonetheless, Catholics, as I said, are bound to believe in the special creation of Adam and Eve. Okay. Now, this is not just due to revelation, by the way. This is actually, it's metaphysically impossible for the rational soul to emerge out of matter. So I want to make that point, that the rational soul, by virtue of its capacity to engage with immaterial realities, by virtue of its capacity to know the existence of God, is in itself, per se, immaterial in its essential operations. So we believe that the human soul is the form of the body, so it is the principle of animation for the body, but it subsists. So that means that it exists and operates and acts fully as itself within itself. And for that reason, by virtue of its subsistence, its essential operation or activity does not need or require the operation of a material organ.
Inquisitas sent $3. I hate how Catholics won't talk about the soul when they criticize evolution or abortion. It's an outrage that school teachers don't use the Bible for debating ideas.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of abortion, this Aristotelian philosophy is actually really important. And not just Aristotelian philosophy, but of course the data of revelation. If you believe that the fetus is a living result of reproduction. So in other words, if you believe that the fetus is, first of all, a being, and second of all, has imminent activity, so it acts of itself, and it is a being, and it has, like I said, an imminent capacity for motion, so the principle of motion or activity within itself, which everybody acknowledges, then you have to believe it is, first of all, a living being, and by virtue of the principle of the form of the body, it has to have a form, so it has to have an identity, and so it's a human identity. And that's what we really mean by the human soul. The human soul is the identity, the organizational principle of the human body. It differentiates a corpse from a living body. It is the principle of life that accounts for a body's capacity for imminent activity. And what differentiates the human soul from animal soul is just the fact that it has this capacity of subsistence. So not only is it the form of the body, it has the capacity to act fully within itself and for itself as a form. So, for example, like the form of a tree or the form of an animal, they exist entirely for the sake of being received in those bodies. Entirely. Whereas for man, our form, our principle of our body's principle of actuality has its own self-contained activity within itself. And for that reason, it's immaterial. And for that reason, it is subsistent within itself and therefore is immortal. And it cannot be annihilated. And it is for that reason, getting back to this point, that it is impossible for the rational soul to emerge from matter. The rational soul has to be immediately and directly created by God. Okay. So, given that, and by the way, if we believe that philosophically, then you necessarily, so even if you're not convinced of Christianity, you have to necessarily ask the question, why would God have chosen to deliberately and directly create a rational human soul out of nothing? There had to be a very specific purpose for that. And so if you establish that principle metaphysically, then you have to come to the conclusion that God created man for a very special purpose. If you don't believe that, then you have to account for how it is the human soul could have come into being as an immaterial subsistence without God's direct and deliberate decision to create it. I don't think that's possible. Okay, so the state of man in original justice and innocence. So we believe, like the angels, we discussed this in the last stream, so like the angels, man was created in a state of sanctifying grace. So what that means is that he was created in a state of harmony and friendship with God, being elevated beyond the capacities of his nature in order toward receiving the vision of God. So, like I said, with the angels are created, and they're created in grace. They're created for the sake of receiving the vision of God. That's the purpose for which they're created. And they're created in grace. And similarly, with us, we are likewise created in grace. We are created with that gift, with that principle of supernatural elevation of the soul, to abide in a state beyond its natural capacities. Now, that being said, while we were created in grace, like the angels, we were not created with the vision of God. So there's a very fundamental distinction between grace and the beatific vision that we want to make sure that we have a good handle on. Because people can ask the question, okay, well, if the angels were created in grace, then how did they sin? Or if we were created in grace, why would we have sinned? Well, there's a fundamental distinction between the vision of God and being created in grace. When you experience the vision of God, you know him perfectly. You know him as he is within himself. Not comprehensively, but you do know him perfectly, according to your capacity to know. And for that reason, that commands, metaphysically, it commands immutably love for God. Perfect knowledge of God commands perfect love of God. And for that reason, simply being created in grace isn't going to account for, or rather I should say, simply being created in grace doesn't mean that you have an incapability to sin. You have that capability because you haven't received perfect knowledge of God. And that only comes as a result of receiving the beatific vision. And the reason why he didn't give people or angels the beatific vision right from the beginning is because out of his wisdom, he wanted us to attain to that as a result of freely cooperating with an invitation. And that invitation is grace. And so with that grace that human beings were created in, in light of that grace, there are these what we would call preternatural gifts that come with human nature being created in grace, that come as by virtue of the grace received. And so I want to walk through some of these gifts that man had received in the very beginning. And so the first of these preternatural gifts, so basically what a preternatural gift is would be the human nature's harmony, essential harmony with the light of grace. So we receive the light of grace, and as a result of that, our nature is illuminated by this grace and is able to act fully in accordance with the light of this grace. And that's because the body was created originally in the state of this grace. So the body was created in harmony with this grace from the very beginning. And for that reason, the body was able to attain to a higher degree of harmony with grace before the fall than it is after the fall with grace. And so after the fall, original sin is transmitted through the body, and so the soul may receive grace after that, but the body is still out of step with the grace, and that's really the basis for concupiscence of the flesh, and that's what we're going to talk about in a little while here. So the preternatural gifts, we have first of all the gift of integrity. So this is going to refer to the complete subjection of the lower appetites of the flesh to the intellect and will, and then the intellect and will to God. Integrity, by the way, is kind of the philosophical basis of beauty. Things are beautiful to the degree to which all of the parts come together in a broader harmony. And so similarly, the lower appetites of the flesh, with the gift of integrity, have a harmony with the intellect and will that is illuminated by grace in relationship to God. the gift of immortality and happiness. So this is by virtue of being made in the state of sanctifying grace, we also receive the gift of immortality. So what does immortality mean in this context? I've already said that the soul is immortal. The soul is immortal by nature. The soul is immortal by nature because of its immaterial subsistence. But humanity is not immortal by nature, because the body needs to be illuminated by grace in order to retain its union with the body in light of threats of corruption. So by virtue of being in the state of sanctifying grace, this obedience to God that comes as a result of that grace merits for us a shield of protection from all bodily harm. Again, speaking about the human person in the state of innocence. And so this is a beautiful quote from St. Augustine on the matter. He says, "Man lived in paradise as he pleased, as long as his pleasure lay in what God had ordained. He lived in the enjoyment of God, the source of all the good there is in man. He lived free from want and might have so lived forever. Food was at hand, lest he should hunger. Drink, lest he thirst. The tree of life, lest old age should undo him. His senses and feelings were undisturbed by bodily decay. He feared no disease from within, no assault from without. In his flesh was perfect health, in his soul perfect peace. As Eden was unvisited by excess of heat or cold, so the will of him who dwelt there was untroubled by fear or greed. No sadness was his, no mere empty pleasure. A steady tide of unceasing joy flowed out to him from God, whom he loved, with the glowing love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and faith undimmed by falsehood or insincerity. Man and wife were there, one in mutual trust, one in honorable love, one in guard they kept over mind and body, one in the easy service of obedience to God's command." So that's Augustine's beautiful description of the state of man in paradise, in the state of paradise. And that comes as a result of the gift of immortality and happiness that flows from the state of sanctifying grace, because the state of sanctifying grace commands the lower appetites to be in perfect union and harmony and obedience to the light of the grace that comes from God through the soul. And so there's this wonderful harmony within the human person that comes as a result of being made, created initially in the state of sanctifying grace. Furthermore, it's not just the bodily faculties that obey the light of the grace, it's also the intellectual faculties, so the intellect and the will. They likewise receive this gift of enlightenment. And as a result of receiving this gift of enlightenment, man's intellect is unclouded by the passions of the flesh. So after the fall, as we all encounter, whenever we fall into various sins of the flesh, we tend to notice a darkening of the mind. I find this very true with a lot of atheists who leave the faith. Even so, I know some people who got into Catholicism, got into Thomism, and they were really bright people. They were able to articulate very wise truths in very wise ways. And when they apostatized, when they left the faith, I noticed them getting dumber. Like I really did. I noticed them declining in intellectual aptitude. And that's not me just saying that because they're not Catholic anymore. Because I recognize that there are a lot of not-Catholics who are way smarter than like I am or anyone. But I noticed their intellectual aptitude diminishing over time. And I think that's because they probably, once they left the faith, they started engaging in more sins of the flesh with impunity, right? And I think that does have a tendency to dull your intellectual aptitude. It has a tendency to cloud the clarity of intellectual vision. Nick made this point actually, and he got a lot of heat for it. Like he got made fun of for it by morons. Where he said that to the degree that you are able to sublimate your sexual desire, then that will channel itself into creative excellence, because that creative excellence comes as a result of the clarity of intellectual vision that is strengthened by a due and holy abstinence from an overindulgence in pleasures of the flesh. And so with the gift of enlightenment, that ensured that any pleasures of the flesh that the body had experienced would be subject perfectly to divine harmony. And that was just an endowment. That was a spiritual endowment that was given as a result of being in the state of innocence, created in the state of sanctifying grace. And so as a result of that, they have this agreeability, this fundamental agreeability and harmony between the natural flesh and supernatural grace. And as a result of that, they are supplied by way of divine infusion knowledge of the things that they had an aptitude to know and a need to know. Furthermore, he was also infused with all of the virtues that flow out of the rational soul, being in harmony and communion with God, including the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. So all of the virtues were also given as a result of this gift of enlightenment. And in light of receiving that gift, and in light of being in this state of innocence, the performances of these virtues were far superior in absolute terms than they are when performed in the fallen world. But relatively speaking, you could argue that when we perform virtues in this fallen flesh, when we avoid vice and when we pursue a life of virtue in spite of the concupiscence of the flesh, there's a relative superiority there, because it's good accomplished in the face of difficulty. And that is always going to mean something very special to God. That's really, in many ways, the purpose for which he permitted a lot of this evil in the first place, is because the greater good that comes out of that is attaining to divine intimacy in the face of hardship, in the face of difficulty, and in the face of temptation. That is in itself a crucible for far greater divine intimacy than could be attained had all of this just been completely effortless from the beginning. And so that gets to the mystery for why God permitted these evils in the first place. Okay. So those are the gifts. Those are the preternatural gifts that come as a result of being created in the state of innocence. Because remember, it's by virtue of the body being created in grace. And so this is what humanity would be like if there was no dissonance between the grace that's in the soul and the body, the state of the body. It's as a result of the original sin and its transmission that the body, through natural generation, transmits original sin, even though the soul receives grace through baptism. It's still the same body, right? It's still the same corrupted body. And for that reason, the body still works outside the domain of these preternatural gifts, even though the soul is deified by way of baptism and the sacrament and so on. Okay. So, man is also, of course, as we know, created male and female. So while all things that God creates reflect his divine perfections, this natural institution of marriage that is created and that proceeds out of the creation of woman, the creation of Eve, this reflects in a very special way the order that God had imbued in the very fabric of the created order. And we can intuit this by just looking at all sorts of categories of created things. We find up and down the levels of being, there's masculine and feminine principles that are reflected throughout all of creation. Metaphysically speaking, you have the relationship between act and potency and form and matter and existence and essence. Those relate to each other in active and passive ways. That's an active and a passive dynamic. And the active and passive dynamic is, I would say, reflected cosmically in the distinction between male and female. Male and female are in many ways a cosmic icon of these higher dualities that exist in creation. You can even go further with it. You can relate the soul to the body. The soul is the active principle of the body. The body, in turn, receives the life that the soul gives to it, and then as a result of that, you have sort of an incubation of the fruits of the body. You can say those are kind of like the procreative fruits of the body receiving the light of the soul. And so the soul and the body relate to each other as a husband does to a wife. And similarly, God relates to the world as a husband does to a wife. That's echoed in Scripture itself. And so you have this duality between masculinity and femininity, male and female, reflected in the whole order of creation. And so God, in his wisdom, he creates humanity to reflect that as this grand cosmic icon of a nuptial relationship. So this is just I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the Catechism does bear this out pretty well. So I'll just read one thing from it. It says, marriage is not purely a human institution, despite the many variations it may have undergone through the centuries and the different cultures, social structures, and spiritual attitudes. These differences should not cause us to forget its common and permanent characteristics. And it goes on to say that for man is created in the image and likeness of God, who is himself love. Since God created him man and woman, their mutual love becomes an image of the absolute and unfailing love with which God loves man. It is good, very good, in the Creator's eyes. And this love which God blesses is intended to be fruitful and to be realized in the common work of watching over creation. And so that's another affirmation that the marital relationship between man and woman is echoed and reflected in the divine order of things. And you actually have this echoed very beautifully in Pope Innocent III's treatise on the fourfold kinds of marriage. He actually says that marriage is itself, between a husband and wife, is itself a reflection of these higher and more primary dualities, like Christ and his church, God and the just soul, and the Logos and human nature. So this is just a very beautiful way of putting it on the part of the Pope there. And so, yeah, so that's the concept of male and female. Again, male, you have this principle of activity, of active, sacrificial offering, the active principle, the principle of actuality, and then you have female, which corresponds to the material, to passivity and reception, but it's more of an active passivity and an active reception, because upon receiving the light of actuality, the passive thing is able to bear that out procreatively. So, for example, with the relationship between form and matter, matter receives form, but as a result of that, you have the fruit of those two things coming together, which is the complete existence of a material object. And again, with the soul and the body, the body is able to perform its faculties and activity, and is able to fulfill its ends as a result of receiving the principle of life that is the soul. And so upon the masculine and the feminine interacting, you do have procreative fruit as a result. So this nuptial union between Christ and the church, that is itself a reflection of the nuptial union between Adam and Eve. This is really the grand purpose for the sake of which mankind exists, generally speaking. So I just want to make sure that that overarching principle is clear. Okay. So, Eve, just drawing a little bit more on the distinction between man and woman in Adam and Eve, Eve is created from the rib of Adam, and this signifies a lot of important mystical truths. So for one, you have the fact that woman is not from man, or woman is from man, not man from woman. And that is actually like Actually, this is partially why you shouldn't believe in the evolution of the human body, because if you believe in the evolution of the human body, then you kind of have to believe that man comes from woman. And that's just not true. That's not biblically true, and common sense tells you that's not true. Man is the principle of origin for the woman, and that is the basis upon which we get concepts like wifely submission and all of those things. And so it's that relationship that keeps us sane about the relationship between men and women in society. If men came from women, then women would kind of have a causal superiority that would undermine the metaphysical foundations of patriarchy, and that's obviously not reflective of reality, right? But the biblical truth is much more resonant with our daily experience. It's intuitively obvious that woman is for the sake of man, and that is true between men and women. That is also true with these higher dualities: matter for the sake of form, body for the sake of soul, church for the sake of Christ. And yes, the active principle does, out of love for the passive, offer himself up to her for her sake, but the causal activity originates with the masculine. And that's a very important mystical and metaphysical principle, and it's echoed in the Bible. It's echoed in Scripture and divine revelation. So Eve is Eve coming from the rib of Adam signifies that. Also, it's echoed in the blood and water that flows out of the side of Christ. So as Eve is fashioned out of the side of Adam, so does this prenatal church that's signified by the blood and water flow out of the side of Christ. Furthermore, Adam was meant to accomplish his work of divine co-creation with and through Eve. That's why he says, this is my flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. He was not, he did not intend to bring about this co-creation of the cosmos with God alone. It is not good for man to be alone, and so Adam is set out to accomplish his work with and through Eve. And this is mirrored in Christ, who accomplishes the work of redemption with and through his mystical body, the church. That's why I think it's very important to insist on a sacramental dimension to the church and a hierarchical dimension to the church and an institutional dimension to the church, because you have to give depth to the church's identity. The church has to have her own distinctive identity in order to really mirror this Adam and Eve dynamic. Because if Christ is going to be the new Adam, then you need a new Eve. And that's typified in the Blessed Virgin. It's also typified in the church. Okay. So the fall of man is obviously going to happen after this. And so what happens in the fall of man, in the original sin, is that you have this breaking of the initial covenant between God and creation. God had intended the whole of material creation to have intimacy with him through mankind. And so when man commits sin, when man violates this original covenant, that original purpose for which the entire cosmos was created is, at least on its face, thwarted. So what did this original sin consist in? I'm not going to run down the whole Genesis story. I mean, I think you know all of that. So what does eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil actually signify? What is the root of the sin here? And, I'm not the first one to say this, obviously, but it refers to the arrogation to themselves of what the standard by which good and evil are to be measured. And so it's the arrogation to themselves of that standard. So in other words, they become the standard by which good and evil is to be measured. And that's at the root of the same Luciferian pride that led to the fall of the angels. So as I said, the sin is therefore a human participation in this Luciferian pride that originally introduced cosmic evil and dissonance into that original divine symphony of creation. And like we said before, man could have been this proto-redeemer of the fallen cosmos if he would have cooperated with this grace. But instead of that, through sin, he tarnishes and he robs of its honor the cosmic image of the image of God, which is the Son of God. And it's for that reason that the image of the Father, namely the Son, is going to be the one to become incarnate and thereby become one with the cosmic image that's summed up in man. So man is the image of God. And in tarnishing the image of God, that robs the image of God of its due honor. And as a result of that, the image of God and the Son is going to be the one to restore this harmony of the divine symphony of creation. Now, one thing it's important to keep in mind is that while the incarnation of the Son of God would eventually bring restoration to this whole project, I do believe, as many others believe, that the Son of God would have become incarnate anyway. So just as man, human beings, human creation, would have redeemed the fallen cosmos, material cosmos, not the fallen angels themselves, obviously, but the fallen cosmos, so the Son of God redeems the fallen proto-redeemer. But while I do believe in that sequence, I do believe that the Son of God would have come anyway had man not sinned. And so for that reason, you can still maintain this sequence of divine order here, even without sin. So even if, for example, the angels didn't sin man still would have been created. And man still would have been able to sum up and recapitulate everything that came before. And likewise, I think even if man hadn't sinned, the Son of God would have become incarnate and therefore would have brought absolute unity and harmony to the whole order of creation, and would have enabled the whole of the material cosmos through the Son of God to not only partake of the divine nature, but to be hypostatically united with the divine nature. So while I'm explaining the sequence of events in light of redemption, that is sort of a added effect that the plan takes on in light of foreseeing these evils. So you have the same basic structure and hierarchy of creation, but it takes on this redemptive value. And that redemptive value brings a richness and a dignity to the cosmos that it wouldn't have brought, that it wouldn't have had without sin. And that's why in the Exultet we speak of "O happy fault, O felix culpa." Okay. So, this sin of our first parents, it's important to point out, is the most grievous sin that outweighs all of the sins that follow it in terms of gravity. So, I mean, that can help us sort of when we think of like the sins that we commit. We can be metaphysically assured that anything that we do is not going to match up in gravity to the sin of the first parents. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason is because they were in such a perfect state of being, they were in such a perfect state of enlightenment and knowledge, that the sin that they committed was done with more freedom of the will than any other sin after them, because we're all weighed down by concupiscence of the flesh and by temptation. And so we don't sin with the same degree of deliberation that Adam and Eve sinned with. And it's similar with the angels, right? Satan is the most evil being because he sinned with the greatest amount of angelic freedom among those angels who sinned. And so he's the most evil for that reason. And so there's a necessary correlation between the degree of freedom you have and the gravity of the sin you commit with that freedom. Okay. So what is original sin in its essence? Well, original sin, it consists in nothing other than the inherited privation or deprivation of original justice or sanctifying grace in the soul. That's the essence of original sin, if you were to define it as to its roots. It's nothing other than the deprivation of original justice or sanctifying grace in the soul. And because the soul is ordered to receiving the supernatural elevation, because there is that proper ordering that is meant to be fulfilled, then being deprived of it takes on the character of sin, because it is hateful in the sight of God in a certain sense. Not in the sense that like God actively like hates those conceived in original sin, but it's just that quality of the soul is repugnant, if you will, to its proper ordering toward God, and that's why it takes on the character of sin. Okay, so the transmission of original sin. This is probably the most mysterious component of original sin. It's something that we're ultimately never going to be able to fully understand because it is a mystery, but it is something we can throw a little bit of light on. So, as we said, original sin consists in nothing other than the inherited privation or deprivation of original justice. So how is it transmitted? What's transmitted by human generation, and it's transmitted in the body in particular. So Adam and Eve, once they had sinned and lost grace, the body is then turned inwardly on itself and therefore weighed down by forces that are out of harmony with the divine life. So because it was only by virtue of supernatural grace that the body was able to be subject to the life of the soul, the life of the deified soul, then without that light, the body reverts to its own devices. And its own devices are always going to be, like its own devices deprived of the grace that it always yearned to receive, is going to be weighed down into irrational and ignoble passions. And once the body reproduces itself in that state, then the fruit of that reproduction is out of step with that original subjection of the body to the light of the deified soul. And it's for that reason that original sin is transmitted by way of human reproduction. There are other reasons too. So, because Adam was created to represent the whole of the human race, that's why he was created, was to be that representative. His sin was on behalf of the whole human race. So everything he did was sort of on behalf of the whole human race. Additionally, God gave the gift of original justice to Adam so that he could transmit it further into his progeny. So the gift of original justice is given to be transmitted. So Adam had the responsibility and the obligation to transmit original justice, original innocence, and to transmit these gifts onto his progeny. That was his task. And so in sinning, he fails to transmit the gifts. So he deprives of his progeny the gift that he was supposed to transmit. And so that's why there's a relationship between Adam's sin and that sin being transmitted to his progeny, because in failing to transmit original justice, he transmits the deprivation of original justice, which is none other than original sin itself. Okay. Another reason is that the intimate relationship between Adam and the members of the human race, it's supposed to mirror the intimate relationship between Christ and the second Adam. So, what Adam does bears direct relevance and impact on the members of the human race, just as Christ has an intimate union and connection with the members of his mystical body. So Adam is the first Adam is the head of the human race. Christ is the head of the mystical body of the church. And so there's an inverse relationship that happens here. Adam's sin echoes down through all the other members of the human race. Christ's righteousness and Christ's divine life also echoes into the members of his mystical body. So there's that relationship between the two. Now, all of that being said, this doctrine of original sin, it cannot really be proved. It cannot be proved, but it can be empirically verified. We know that, again, God created the human soul. And if God created the human soul, he would have created the human soul to have some kind of a relationship with him. And yet, we know that in our experience of daily life, in our experience of the human sojourn, our bodily existence is out of step with the soul's yearning for God. We know that. And we know that God would not have created it that way initially. And so there had to be something that happened that led to this problem that was outside of the antecedent will of God. Okay, so the effects of original sin. What effect does that have on us? Well, the first thing is the loss of these supernatural endowments. So the loss of which stems from the loss of sanctifying grace. And as a result of that, we also lose the preternatural gifts that were ordered toward sanctifying grace and given life in and through sanctifying grace. And so once the sanctifying grace is lost, the preternatural gifts are lost. And furthermore, as a result of the loss of sanctifying grace and the gifts, we receive these wounds of original sin. Now, these wounds should not be translated as a total depravity of human nature, as the Calvinists would have us believe, but they do consist in ignorance, malice, weakness, and concupiscence. So ignorance, meaning we have this weakening of the mind. Supernatural grace gave an enlightenment of the mind, an ease with which the mind can attain to truth. Without that supernatural grace, we now attain truth with difficulty. Malice refers to the weakening of the will, so a lower degree of willpower in the face of temptation. And we have the strengthened willpower, again, by virtue of supernatural grace in the soul. We also have the effect of weakness, which is basically an aversion to struggle. So a lack of fortitude. Again, we received the strength through the light of grace, and that's gone. So now we are lost in this weak state. And we have concupiscence, and that's just a general inclination toward evil, an inclination toward the lower passions of the flesh, an inclination to sin. And again, because we have lost the state of sanctifying grace, the body is now weighed down to concupiscence, to the lower passions of the flesh. So these are the wounds that result from the state of original sin. Now, because God is still infinitely generous and wants man to partake of his inner life, he's going to chart out a plan of salvation to reconcile man and the order of creation back to himself through his own Son, becoming flesh and conquering sin and death, and thereby restoring humanity to this intimate relationship with God. Again, he created us out of the superabundance of his generosity, and so he's not going to permit us to be doomed to this fate. And this is hinted at in Genesis 3:15. We call it the proto-evangelion, the proto-gospel, where he says to the serpent, to Satan, he says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman." That's going to refer to the Blessed Virgin, mystically, between your seed and her seed referring to Christ. You shall strike at your head while you strike at his heel. So he's going to affect the crucifixion, but the crucifixion will, of course, result in the resurrection and ascension from the dead. So this is the ultimate plan of salvation that God has in store for the human race in light of original sin. But to do that, God is going to begin this overarching plan of salvation. So he's going to prepare his advent into the world through a series of covenant with the people that he chooses as a vehicle through which he's going to enter into time and space. Yeah, I see someone making that Neon Genesis Evangelion connection. Yeah. Yep. So basically, what we want to say is that even in spite of original sin, even in spite of the fallen state of mankind, God nevertheless still has this desire on his part to bring about what he had originally intended in, again, that original divine symphony that he wanted to manifest into creation. Um, remember, creation mirrors this Trinitarian dynamic. God acts toward creation in the same way that he acts within his own Trinitarian life. So he communicates himself, and the result of that divine self-communication is meant to return in love back to the principle of origin. So the Father generates the Son, and the Son loves the Father back in the Spirit. And so when he creates the world, when he creates the material cosmos, he creates it with the intention of that material cosmos echoing that love back toward him, and finding a participation in his own inner life, and finding thereby glory through that dynamic, through that Trinitarian dynamic. And so just because there's sin in the world, he's still going to follow through with that initial primordial divine intention for the sake of which he created the world. So and what you find is that sin entering into the world brings about a far grander arc of salvation, a far grander return of the many to the one than would have been brought about without sin. Because now you have God creating the world, and the world the cosmos united in a human nature, which is in turn united to the Son. Creation can return back to God from a far deeper falling away. And that brings about a far greater glory. See, glory is in many ways commensurate with the difficulty with which it took to get to that glory. So the greater the difficulty to persevere through, to enter into glory, the greater that glory is going to be. And so God, in permitting creation to fall away from himself and to return back to him through Christ, through the death of Christ, and through the resurrection and ascension of Christ, you get a far grander arc of cosmic history than you would have otherwise. And so that's just a way to understand it. So, last thing I want to do before I get into the book recommendations is just say a little word on the whole issue of limbo. I know I think that was brought up in chat, and it is one of those questions that a lot of people have. And, there are a lot of different opinions on it. There are a lot of different ways to think about it. But I think the best way to approach it, and actually Ludwig Ott bears this out in his Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, is to understand limbo as less of a as less of a theological certainty as a theological conditional. In other words, the dogmatic certainty that we get from limbo really has to do with just affirming the absolute necessity of baptism for salvation, the grace of baptism for salvation. So, in other words, what limbo tells us is that if there are any human persons who die in the state of original sin, so without the grace of baptism, they obviously cannot receive the beatific vision necessarily. So where do they go is that question. They would go to a state of eternal natural bliss. So that's on the supposition that such people exist, or that actually happens or obtains in reality. Now the question becomes: do we have to be committed to the notion that actually happens? And that's shrouded in a little bit more uncertainty. But if you affirm, as we are supposed to affirm from sacred scripture, that God has a universally salvific will, and you affirm that God doesn't command the impossible, then that can serve as a firmly rooted foundation for, at the very least, having a reasonable hope that those infants would be brought into salvation by way of some kind of extraordinary bestowal of the grace of baptism in a way that we just don't know or see. Because God is not bound by his sacraments. He's not bound by his sacraments. And for that reason, he's perfectly at liberty to bestow the grace of baptism as a remedy for the evil of a premature death. He's fully capable of doing that. He's God after all. And so I think we can believe in that as as very much a reasonable hope that would happen. And limbo remains, again, as a way of affirming the absolute necessity of the grace of baptism for salvation. So I think that's a good way to kind of understand it. And I think the Church's Magisterium has, not in an official capacity, but in a less official capacity, has given credence to this view. So that's the whole 6 days of creation. That is the paradise in which man was created. That's the concept of original sin. I hope that was helpful for you guys. I hope that was interesting. I hope you got something out of that. What I want to do right now is just clue you guys in on some of the books that I got, some of these ideas from that kind of helped me to think about these things. And in the meantime, if you want to ask any last-minute questions or support the stream, you can do that here through powerchat.live/classicaltheist. So in the meantime, I'll let you guys know the reading material that you can refer to. Okay, so the Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma is key. Everybody should be getting that book. If you don't have that book, you should just get it now. It's a really helpful way to navigate through the doctrines of the faith in a readable way, in an accessible way, and in a comprehensive way. So that's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma by Ludwig Ott. The Tour of the Summa. So that's partially a way of me just saying read the Summa, but also the Tour of the Summa by Paul J. Glenn is a really good summary of everything that's contained in the Summa. So you really should read A Tour of the Summa by Paul J. Glenn. And it goes over the 6 days of creation there as well, and a little bit of original sin too. So that's important. Augustine's City of God. I'm sure a lot of you have read that, or have read bits and pieces of it at least. But that's very important too. It's very much a foundational text for reading patristic interpretations of Genesis. Another author that has helped me quite a bit is Robert Grosseteste. Robert Grosseteste was a medieval scholastic, and he has a lot of wonderful thoughts about the role of man in the cosmos, and he has his own Hexameron, so he has his own work on the 6 days of creation. You guys should look into Robert Grosseteste. He's really good. And Augustine also has his commentary, on the book of Genesis too. Another good biblical commentator that you can read is Haydock. So if you read through the book of Genesis with Haydock's notes, like you can get a lot of good commentary there. He gives you a lot of really good quick references for what some patristic interpretations are of some various passages. So that's a good place to go as well. You can also look at the book Shadows of Reality by Deneliu. That's a really good book on biblical typology. So if you want to kind of learn about what Adam and Eve were meant to signify in light of the New Testament, you're going to want to look at that book. That's all about Old Testament typology. It's really good. Another work by St. Thomas is De Malo, or On Evil. That's a really good work for unpacking for his concept of original sin. You'll learn a lot about original sin from St. Thomas's De Malo. This is a book that's really good if you want a nice, comprehensive philosophical treatment of evolution, and that's going to be From Aristotle to Darwin and Back Again by Etienne Gilson, who's one of my favorite authors. He basically makes the case that, look, if you're going to accept any of this evolutionary stuff, you can't get it without a concept of final causality. You can't get it without a concept of teleology. And so really the whole evolutionary account of biodiversity can't even really get off the ground without appealing back to medieval philosophical concepts. Not just medieval philosophical concepts, but also ancient philosophical concepts. Basically the perennial philosophy. You don't have a workable framework within which even to understand evolution without that. And so Gilson helps bear that out. Another author that helps bear that out is and make that argument is Edward Fazier's Aristotle's Revenge. That's a really good book to read if you just want a quick and accessible approach to modern science in light of Thomistic philosophy. I think there are some problems with the book, though. Like I think that he is too willing to accept qualitative interpretations of science on face value, at face value. I think he should really try to challenge those a little bit more head on. But it's still a wonderful book. I think a better author to do that would be Wolfgang Smith. He's a wonderful author of the traditionalist school. He is Catholic, and he has a wonderful and ingenious framework within which to understand quantum mechanics, and he uses a lot of Thomistic philosophical principles to get there too. So those are just some really good books to look at if you're interested in that. All right. I hope all of you were helped by the stream in some way or another. Hope it was enjoyable. Thank you everyone who donated. Just want to give a special thanks to Requiem. Thank you very much to Requiem and Anonymous and American Boy. I think you guys gave the most in that. So thank you very much for that. That's really appreciated. All right. God bless you guys, and I'll see you later.